let's start with Matt. And Matt has a great thing that I like to call the rat casino. And Matt is studying research on some fascinating things about neurology and gaming. So Matt,
well,
you want to take it away?
let me start a little bit just by introducing kind of the mission of our institute and where our faculty fit into it. And really, we just have a small scattering of the faculty that are involved in our institute, and I'll talk more about its interdisciplinary nature in just a second. But this is our mission statement. It's to understand the individual and societal factors that contribute to problem gaming, identify points of intervention to prevent problem gaming, and support the state of Ohio's regulation of gaming through the use of data analytics. That's a pretty broad mission, but really boils down to three things: treatment, prevention, and data. And data is necessary for treatment and intervention. We are intentionally, I don't know, what's the word you use, nonpartisan?
We couldn't be more nonpartisan.
We recognize that gaming has an entertainment value and that a lot of individuals want it to take place in their state for both business and entertainment purposes and tax revenue purposes. But as Bill's talk really highlighted, the need for good management of those and good treatment of those issues that surround gaming certainly need to be embraced by all parties involved. And so our mission is really to support both the state and the individuals who are involved in gaming. And really by kind of proxy, what we do in Ohio is within the broader world of gaming. And so, what we can manage to convince our legislators to do can be used as a model for other states. Our failures can be used as a model in other states as well. So we hope to partner with other states to develop better nationwide regulation of these systems. So we sort of partner with, oops, I lost it now. There we go. We partner with state officials. We have lots of industry partners as well, and our institute down here is part of the university. And our goal is to bring these three parties together to figure out effective strategies to prevent problem gaming, treat problem gaming, and regulate the industry in an effective way that allows it to move forward but still maintain these other goals that we have. And the Institute is really centered within a lot of other institutes at Miami, things like the Center for Data Analytics, the Center for Neuroscience and Behavior, which I'm a part of, Statistical Consulting, the Gerontology Center. The list could go on. There's lots and lots of centers involved, and the Institute leverages the expertise of each of those centers to develop a true multidisciplinary perspective on problem gaming. We're not just purely interested in it from a psychology perspective. I'm in a psychology department, and my background is in psychology. That's what my Ph.D. is in. But I recognize that gaming is bigger than just psychology. And so we really do have a very multidisciplinary pool of faculty involved. We recognize that games are changing. Bill's talk really highlighted that, right? There are new games coming about constantly, some of which are legalized and regulated, some of which aren't. The opportunities to engage in gaming are changing dramatically. Even in the last year, we've had more and more states legalizing esports betting, electronic sports betting, not esports betting, but electronic sports betting. Even in, Bill mentioned Native American communities engaging in new and creative forms of gambling as well. There's a lot of drive to increase the opportunities for gaming. And we also know that the treatments for gaming are changing as well. You're all experts in this. You recognize, and I'm sure all of you are aware of all of the new changes that are coming about and how to manage problem gaming treatment. Even just how to approach potential clients is, in the last 5 years has changed dramatically. And so our institute's perspective on this is that if all of these things are changing, our approach to the prevention and treatment of gaming have to change too. Right? We've got to think about gaming in a different way than just simply brick and mortar casinos, than simply lotteries, because that world, while it's still here, is only a small fraction of what's to come. And so we study gaming from an interdisciplinary perspective. We advise our state policy makers on gaming matters. Bill and I have traveled up to the State House a number of times to talk with state representatives. And we provide workforce professional development training for industry individuals who are interested in problem gaming. Our focus is on problem gaming, though. We're not interested in training people on how to run a casino. We're interested in training them how to think about problem gaming. So we do have a really multidisciplinary set of faculty involved. These are just a few of the people. So you can see, for instance, Sharon's up here. Here's me. Glenn's over here in the corner. We've got people from statistics, people from sports leadership and management. We've got people from economics. There's me in psychology, family science and social work, gerontology. This is, again, just a small set of the people involved. How many faculty do we have now involved? 20?
Yeah.
25?
And we just got that new group, and it's growing constantly.
And you can see how interdisciplinary this is, right? It's not just about the treatment from a psychology perspective. It's about how gaming affects sports, right? Because it does. Name, image, and likeness is going to dramatically change the way that colleges interact with their athletics programs. The presence of sports betting in an era of name, image, and likeness is a recipe for really bad stuff. And we need to recognize that on a college campus, how these factors are going to converge. And so, thinking about the problem gaming from more than just the perspective of the individual gaming addict and more about how it affects our entire culture surrounding gaming is really needed we've got to embrace that sort of perspective to be effective at treating and preventing the disease. So I want to give you a little bit of background on my research and my perspective on this. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist, which means I focus mostly on the brain. My research focuses on the neurobiology of decision making, and I'm particularly interested in novel therapeutics for mental health disorders. I kind of approach this from a multidisciplinary perspective as well. Disordered decision making isn't unique to gamblers. We see it in individuals with OCD, with anxiety disorders, with depression. And so I'm really thinking about novel therapeutics for decision making. I'll couch them in the context of depression or addiction, but I'm really thinking about it more as disordered decision making. And it's going to be characteristic across a lot of disorders. So I do have a strong emphasis on addictive disorders because that's where the money is and you got to follow the dollars. But that's sort of my broad focus. And as Bill mentioned, I have what I call the Rat Casino Lab. We have a casino in my lab designed not for humans, but for rats. So all of my work is in rodents. I don't study humans. And you might be thinking, well, why should I care about rodents? They're not people. They don't get diseases like we do. And you're right, they don't. But they develop close proxies for those diseases. And they allow us some really important strengths. For instance, I can better control the environment of the rat. I know exactly what they're exposed to at all periods of time, and I can customize the game that the rat plays to its own predilections to gamble. So using our rat casino, for instance, I can tweak the parameters of the casino to drive rats to become, quote, gambling addicts, or drive them away from this. Simply shifting the parameters of the game can influence whether they develop that condition or not. And if you think regular casinos aren't doing this, you're probably wrong. So here's a video of my rat casino. Here's my rat in the casino. He's presented with two levers to press. One is a risky lever. If he selects it and wins, he gets a lot of sugar pellets. Rats are hungry. They love sugar pellets, just like your dogs love treats. My rats love sugar pellets. So if he gambles and wins, he gets some sugar pellets here. Let's start the video over for a second. So here's the risky lever. Think of it as a risky slot. He pulls the risky slot and he wins. He gets a bunch of sugar pellets. He's a happy rat. This other lever over here that's going to pop out in just a second, this one is not risky. Every time he presses it, he gets a very small amount of sugar pellets, one sugar pellet. Right? So in this case, he's going to press it again, and he didn't get any sugar pellets. He lost. And so let's see what he does on the next trial. The rat lever comes out. And just like a normal human would, since he lost, he's going to go choose the certain lever. He's hungry. He wants his treats. Instead of getting a lot at risk, he's going to choose just one sugar pellet for certain. Right? So we can change the parameters of the game. We can make the probabilities different. We can make the cues that predict the probabilities different so the rat's aware of what's happening. This sort of perspective really allows us dynamically to control the game on a moment-by-moment basis based on what the animal is doing, just like casinos do. Right? They're looking at your play on the table. They're looking at what plays you made in the past, and they're tweaking things to to keep you involved in the game, to keep you betting more. They're not changing the probabilities like we do necessarily, but they're keeping you engaged and involved in the game in a way that you might not choose to otherwise. And so we do that with our rats, and we can do that in a very controlled way in rats that we can't do it with humans. Okay, so using rats also allows us to better control the development of the animal. You all know that early life factors are an important predictor of who will develop these diseases. And so we can very rigorously control the developmental situations of our rats, not just their genetics, but also their early life experiences, their adolescence, their social interactions, all of this sort of stuff. So one of my favorite examples of how my lab has studied this is by modulating early life experiences with alcohol. So this is a video. Well, where did we go here? This is a video. I don't know, it's a little dim. It's at night. This is our rat eating Jell-O shots, because that's what kids like to do. This is an adolescent rat consuming Jell-O shots, just like people might be doing on a college campus. And so we can allow our adolescents to drink in a way that would not be ethical in humans. I can't bring a bunch of kids into my lab and get them drunk, but I can do that with rats. And we know that early life experiences with alcohol shape later decisions. In fact, and I'll show you some data in just a second showing that early life experiences with alcohol can shift animals to prefer risky outcomes over safe outcomes. It actually predisposes them to form these gambling disorders, if you will, and reshapes the way the brain characterizes those disorders. I'll show you that in just a second. And we can also control their biology. So, for instance, I can modulate the neural systems associated with reward to drive animals to form these sort of predilections for gambling. And an example of how I do this is another rat, and we've stuck a wire into its brain, and we are directly stimulating the systems of the brain involved in reward. So essentially, this rat can experience the most physiologically pleasurable experience possible by this direct electrical stimulation. And so now, combined with our control of their environment and their developmental context, we can look at how changing the saliency of a reward shifts animals to desire to gamble or not, right? We can take away more pleasurable experiences and see how that affects their desire to gamble. In other words, if you put someone into a sparse environment where they don't have a lot of factors and a lot of enjoyment in life, does that make them gamble more, right? We can control their biology in a way that would not be necessarily ethical to do in humans. But the goal of all of this is to use these sort of three tools that we have with animals to develop causal inference about biology and environmental factors and how they're causing disordered gaming. And then we use that information to develop new treatments and therapeutics. And so the last kind of branch of my lab is about therapeutics development. So we're doing a lot of work on kind of the early biology and what things transition animals from healthy, safe decision-making to disordered decision-making. But we're also doing a lot on how to develop new therapeutics to treat the disease. And my lab has a corporate partnership with SciBio Therapeutics, which is a pharmaceutical company. And we're piloting out a lot of their new medications to try and treat disordered gaming from a multidisciplinary perspective, not just by changing the environment or providing therapy, but through pharmaceuticals. Are there ways or strategies that we could treat these diseases? Because there are currently no pharmaceuticals on the market to treat disordered gaming. So this is an example of sort of the data that I was talking about a moment ago about how early experience with alcohol reshapes the way your brain perceives risk. This is data from one of our papers back in 2015. This is showing the neural encoding of a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. That's right up here in the front of your brain. You may have heard of it. It's really important for decision making. And what we've done here is look at activity patterns in the prefrontal cortex when animals place bets on our rat casino. And what we show is that animals that consume a lot of alcohol in adolescence, even if they don't consume alcohol again for the rest of their life, purely consuming it in adolescence, causes their prefrontal cortex to be less active when animals make bets. In other words, the prefrontal cortex is not controlling that behavior as well. That's its job. And these animals, in turn, go on to engage in a lot more risky behaviors than a normal, healthy animal that doesn't consume alcohol. These are the control animals here. You can see their activity rates in the prefrontal cortex are about 2 to 3 times higher, implying that it's exerting a lot more control over their behavior. So adolescent alcohol consumption is a huge risk factor for a lot of psychiatric diseases, including gaming disorders. And so this is some neurophysiological data that my lab collected to support that. So that's sort of the perspective that my lab takes on this. So I'm just one player in this institute, though, right? As I mentioned, we've got a lot of faculty involved here. So my biological perspectives and my perspectives on environment and early life factors will kind of combine with our other experts on the panel and back at Miami to give us a multidisciplinary perspective on the topic. So I'm going to turn things over to Glenn to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his perspectives on this.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I'm Glenn Platt. I am a professor in both the Department of Marketing and the Department of Emerging Technology and Business and Design. I'm the founder of that department, as well as the founder of our esports program. What I'd like to do here today is kind of try to get us from 0 to 50 here and talking about specifically esports and also video games, which are different things. My goal here is to do 3 things. So first, I'd like to just introduce esports because I suspect some of us aren't terribly well versed in what this is and sort of what is the scale and scope of it. The second thing I want to talk about is gambling in esports and where that lives right now. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of games, esports, and potentially gambling and all of that as well. So let's start with the what is esports. Any game, any video game that has a win state, in other words, where someone can win and someone can lose, potentially could be an esport. So there are many, many different ways esports differs from traditional sports. It's kind of like, you know how light is like a particle or a wave, depending on how you look at it? Esports is kind of like traditional sports sometimes, but then in other ways, it's very much nothing like traditional sports. So we're going to kind of move back and forth between those as we talk about this. But any video game can theoretically be an esport. There is an esports league for a game called Farming Simulator, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a farming simulator. And there is a league, and there are people who compete. And so, you know, in a way that's very different from traditional sports, like there is only one football, there is only one basketball or one baseball. In esports, we're really just talking about a category of games, and that category is incredibly dynamic. So when I talk in a moment here about esports betting, there are 3 games right now that are sort of the primary games that esports betting is happening, but next year that list could look entirely different. There is no governing body that says this is the esport and everybody plays that esport. It's very much crowd-based. So if lots of people like a game, it plays, and so games kind of rise and fall and are constantly shifting in this space. Secondly, around sort of what is this, the esports and video games, this is a hard one to kind of get your head around, but they're different things. And often the conversation around esports and games sort of convolutes the two, right? So when we talk about whether or not video game addiction is a thing, that's a different thing than even talking about esports. In fact, people who play video games and people who are fans of esports are often very different communities. So esport is in this way, it's like a traditional sport, right? The fan of esports is someone who wants to watch this, someone who enjoys watching games. And before I get the typical response when I talk about the scale and scope of people who watch games, because it's about 650 million people in the world who watch esports regularly. The typical response I hear is, so let me get this straight. People sit around and watch other people play video games, right? I'm sure someone in this room is thinking that.
Could you see their faces?
And I just would like to remind you that you sit around and watch people play basketball games, and you sit around and watch people play golf games, and you sit around and watch people play poker games. It's just not a game that you may be familiar with, and so when you watch it, you don't understand what's going on. But the most popular game in the world is what? Sport game.
Soccer.
Cricket. Cricket.
Yeah.
Right? And I have had cricket explained to me countless times, and I watch it and I have no clue what is going on, right? Like, and that's kind of the way you got to think about esports, right? If you're not someone who's kind of steeped in it and been kind of brought up in it, it's going to look weird. It's going to look like something that you just can't understand what's happening. But make no mistake, the athletes who play in these, and I will call them athletes, the athletes who play in professional esports are freaks of nature in the same way LeBron James is, in the same way any other exceptionally talented athlete is. They've measured the cortisol levels of professional esports players, and they're on par with fighter pilots. They have 4 times faster reaction times than average human beings. They have actually parts of their brain related to reaction time are bigger, like are physically bigger. These folks are exceptionally talented, and so watching the same way you might watch a football game or a basketball game to see an incredibly talented player do what they do, people watch folks play these games to watch these incredibly talented people do what they do, because they will do things that will just absolutely blow your mind, right? So esports has this kind of dynamism to it. It definitely skews younger. So if you look at the audience for esports, it kind of peaks in the 18 to 24 range, then 24 to 35 is actually pretty significant too. But there absolutely is the 60 and over population, that around 10% or so who watch video game content on a regular basis. I did a year-long consulting engagement with the AARP, who are very interested in getting actively. In fact, I think they're going to sponsor a professional esports team of senior players. Now, here's the bad news. You are all too old. They think esports players peak professionally probably around 20 years old, maybe 21. So the path to professional esports is actually high school to pro. It is not college to pro. Once you graduate college, you're on the verge of being a little too old to be a pro player. So, the senior team that AARP have will be adorable, I'm sure, but is undoubtedly not going to be a tremendously winning team, to say the least. PricewaterhouseCoopers graded all sports in the world by their potential for growth and then ranked them. Esports was the #1 sport on that list. Soccer was #2. It is the fastest growing sport in the world. The revenue on a year-to-year basis is 20-30% revenue growth in this space. It's a $3 billion industry. And here, if you remember no other statistic than this, here's the one you need to remember. That for 18 to 34-year-olds, they watch more video game content than all other traditional sports combined. So on a weekly basis, they watch more game content than football, baseball, basketball. Add them all up, they watch more video game content. Like, there is absolutely no doubt that this is the future of entertainment, that this is the future of sport, and where sport goes, betting goes as well, right? So I am part of the leadership team on a national organization called Voice of Intercollegiate Esports that's trying to kind of help create sort of some guidelines around how this works at the collegiate level. Because right now, esports is so new. For many of you in this room, it may be entirely new. There are no rules. There are 0 rules in this space. You can go pro to college. You can get paid while you're in college and doing it. Even cheating and betting are just sort of nascent notions that people haven't even gotten their head around. And the technology advances far faster than the folks that are thinking about sort of regulating it and understanding it. It is an incredibly fast-moving space. To get a sense of the the dollars that change hands in this space, Dota 2, which is one of the major esports, their kind of world championships has a prize pool of about $40 million. the most winning professional esports player in the world is probably pulling in, easily 5 or 10 million a year. If you take winnings from games, but actually endorsements and sponsorship are a far bigger piece of it. There are professional teams, but they tend not to be city-oriented. They tend more to be national in a sense. So there's Cloud9, for example, is an affiliate with a city, but then there are some esports teams that are city-affiliated. So the NBA has an esport league called NBA 2K for their video game, and they have city-based, like the Cleveland Cavaliers have an esports team, that type of thing. Miami University was the first Division I school in the country to have a varsity esports team. We've held national championships, and we compete in 5 different games. We have multiple arenas across campus that we compete in. An arena in esports is basically a glorified computer lab, so don't get too impressed. It's not like a basketball arena. An arena, yeah. So when people think about esports, they do think about these pictures. This is a basketball arena, but it is worth noting that these are very typical audiences for esports finals. They look a lot like this. So pre-pandemic, Madison Square Garden, the Staples Center, right? Take that just as a starting point, had finals in some of these esport games that we've been talking about, and those finals sold these places, like the Staples Center, Madison Square Garden, sold out in 1 hour. In 1 hour. And when things get back to normal, you should go to one of these to just feel the energy. It's nuts. I mean, it dwarfs any other sport, simply because the action is just so constant. There's just constant yelling and screaming and waving of things. We have just started a master's degree in esports management just because this requires event management and understanding marketing and coaching and teams and psychology, all of the things related to that. So that's a sort of quick introduction. Esports, this is our arenas, like I said, glorified computer labs.
Are you okay taking questions now, or do you want me to begin?
Real quick.
Yeah.
In the previous picture.
Yeah.
The traditional sports was always aired on TV. How many are viewing this online?
Now, this is a somewhat controversial question. So you will hear advocates for esports tell you that events, these big final events, like the final in League of Legends, had more people watch it than any other sporting event than the Super Bowl, because they have some numbers that support that. I do not believe those numbers. I know enough about how they're collected to, like, if someone logs in 2 different times, it counts as 2 people. There's all sorts of things that are a little sketchy about it. But I think it's safe to say that in online viewing, it's way past Final Four kind of audiences, right? And I think probably maybe a more important statistic is that the average viewing session of a video game, sort of live video game streaming, is 2.5 hours. The average person watches it for 2.5 hours every time they sit down. And the gender breakdown is even. So there's a misconception that men are the only audience of it. Now, there is a gender problem in the playing of esports. Esports is almost entirely professionally male and white, and there's no reason for that. Men and women are equally able to play the game. So there are some issues there, but in terms of audience, in terms of people who watch it, it is very much evenly split. I can answer more questions about esports when we get to our Q&A portion. I do want to talk just a little bit about gambling in esports. Because as I said, where sports go, gambling goes. Here's kind of like, what was it, the known unknowns speech. Like, we don't know anything about gambling in esports. We truly don't. There is so little research that's been done on it, largely because it's incredibly hard to do research on it, because this gambling is happening outside of kind of traditional ways that we might see it, and the identity of people who are doing it is entirely obfuscated, right? So, there was a study done in the UK where they argued that minors are disproportionately betting on esports, and they based that conclusion on the fact that tweets about gambling on esports were happening disproportionately by people who they thought were minors, because you don't actually know who someone is on Twitter, right? Like, that's complete nonsense. But that's that's the state of things right now. So when you read the numbers, they think about $15 billion a year is bet on esports right now. I have seen estimates of that rising to anything from 150 billion by 2027 to 250 billion by 2027. And gambling on esports occurs very much like traditional gambling, in that you can bet on someone winning a game or losing a game, right? These pro teams there are tournaments, there are teams, there are players, but allegiance in esports tends to be to a player and not to a team. So while you may be a fan of the Cincinnati Bengals, a fan of an esports team will be a fan of a specific player on that team. And if that player moves to a different team, then that's great. They're going to follow that player. And so fantasy esports is actually a fairly big thing, because you can kind of pick and choose people instead of aligning with an entire team. So there are those traditional forms of betting that you might think. And then there's the kind of betting like Bill was talking about earlier, which is skins and digital assets. This is such a big market space. It's hard to even be sort of overly hyperbolic about it. In one of the games, the sort of major games where people buy and sell digital assets called Axie Infinity, every month people are buying and selling something on the order of $400 million worth of digital assets. These aren't real things. These are just digital things. This is a cape or a piece of digital land in a digital world. 400 million, and that's just one game. So the scale and scope of this is hard to get your head around, because the gambling happens in sort of traditional cash type ways, and also in this kind of skin-based gambling ways. Gambling in esports primarily happens with 3 games. League of Legends, which is probably the world's biggest esport. League of Legends is basically just capture the flag. It's a very hard to follow but digital version of capture the flag. Dota 2, which I mentioned earlier, and a game called CSGO, which stands for Counter-Strike Global Objective, Global Offensive? Objective. Global Offensive. Thank you, offensive. I was like, it's not objective. That one's like a shooter game. That's the kind of, when you think about a video game like the guys with the guns and people's heads exploding, that's that kind of a game. But there's a whole lot that we don't know about this. Last thing I want to talk about really quickly is the future of this. And here's the really scary part. This is whenever I tell Bill this, Bill, I can see his head exploding.
That's most of it.
And I don't want to drop tons of jargon, because I'm a super anti-jargon person. I hate jargon. Academics are the worst with jargon. Just, if we can make the simple sound complicated, we absolutely will do that. But I'm going to use the word metaverse here. Because there has been an evolution towards the thing that's called P2E games, or play-to-earn games. So Axie Infinity, the game I mentioned, is a play-to-earn game. So here's how this works. When you play the game, you get rewarded with an in-game currency for winning. And that in-game currency is a cryptocurrency. And so it's convertible into cash in any currency, in any part of the world. So there are, I'm not exaggerating, countries of people that are playing this game to make a living, because they can make $5 a day playing Axie Infinity, which almost anyone could. And $5 a day is a lot of money in some countries, right? So these games let you earn money in this cryptocurrency, and then you can use that cryptocurrency to buy these skins, and you can convert this to any other currency. So money laundering now becomes a huge consideration, because money and assets are changing hands, in this fluid way that's behind this veil. And likewise, the playing of the game, so now this is very different from a lot of other traditional sports, because you're actually earning when you're playing this game, and then you can gamble off of those earnings from your work. Not earning by winning, you're earning by sort of the act of sort of pushing forward in the game, which is different than earning money by playing poker. That's a very different thing. But then once you have that currency, you can use it to buy and sell things. And so that's a game. Now imagine that you have multiple games and someone can move their identity and their wallet with all of this stuff in it and this money between these games. That's basically what the metaverse is. So when you hear people talk about the metaverse, it's just the idea that you have a virtual identity and you can move it between different sort of contexts. But as this becomes a thing, right, the notion of a casino is what Bill was talking about, like virtual casinos become a thing and are a thing. I mean, you know, there's, and in the world of economics, which as was mentioned is kind of my history, you know, they always talk about the opportunistic weeds in new markets, you know, and it's gambling and porn. That's kind of, you know, when the internet first started, that was the first stuff that went out there. And that's what we're seeing, not the porn part, but the gambling part in esports is what we're seeing right now, that as this metaverse is expanding, gambling is sort of taking hold in this metaverse space as sort of virtual casinos. And since identity is basically, I mean, cryptocurrency is not an anonymous world, but it's called pseudonymous. It's pretty close. It becomes very, very hard to know what people are doing, to monitor it, to regulate it, to restrict it. And that toothpaste is out of the tube. So simply waving our hands and saying, you know, we're going to make it illegal isn't going to solve that problem, because that's not going back in the tube in any way, shape, or form.
Really?
I know, it's shocking as that may be.
But I'm a legislator, I made it illegal.
So those are the three things I wanted to talk about. I'm sorry I talked
You're
a little
fine,
longer
you're
and I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but we can Q&A this all you want. And this is part of what the role of our center is all about. You know, we're here to try to help educate people about things they need to be thinking about.
Kind of regretting going last though. Like, this is really exciting stuff, and now I'm like, oh, let's talk about treatment.
These are your people.
These are my people, and I am not an academic. I'm a clinician that happens to work at university, is what I keep telling myself. So I am Sharon Custer. I am a licensed social worker. I try to stay as active in the field as I can while also supporting our students. And so when I was asked to join this team, I will be honest, I was sort of like, oh, like, I'm not sure. Like, I don't have a rat casino. I don't, understand some of these dynamics. But the reality is what we're already doing in the field is what we're going to be doing in the field again, right? But we need to think about who are we doing this with. And I've been watching your body language, and I have to say, I wish I could almost like have a mirror in front of you, because some of you, your mouths are still on the floor. And you're like, oh, I'm not ready for this, or I can't believe I have to learn all of it. Like, I thought I knew everything that I needed to know. And that's really the biggest thing that we want to prepare you for today, is this awareness. Most of my work to date has been a lot around prevention. And when we want to talk to young people about how not to get pregnant, or even not to have sex ideally, I have 2 teenagers, we have this talk frequently, I'm not ready to be a grandma. We talk, right? We let them know comprehensively what we want them, the components of that. Same thing with substance use. We talk, we let them know what's out there. We make them, not a scared straight program, but we make them aware of the consequences and the resources, and if they're concerned about their friends in certain capacities, what do we need to do? And we really need to think about what are we saying to young people about prevention when it comes to gaming in the same way. Both of my kids are on their screens all the time. My son was probably consider himself a gaming wannabe. He tries really hard, but he's almost 20. He's a sophomore up at Miami, and I keep saying, oh, you should check out Esports. And he's like, no, Mom. But I know he's watching it. I hear him at 4 o'clock in the morning when I'm trying to go to bed and sleep. So, but I can be honest with you, I haven't sat down with him and really talked to him about gambling. I haven't talked to him about resources. And I think these are the kinds of things we need to think about for those of you, especially working in schools or doing prevention with young people, especially we were talking about those college-age students, recognizing the potential there and helping them make smart decisions, because we don't want everyone to assume that just because you gamble and game that it's going to be an addiction. We also, I'm just a huge advocate of building resilience in other ways. When you look at what comes, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, you're my people, but we know that when they have resilience and they can make good problem-solving decisions and they have resources and they have supports, that they're less likely to engage in those other problem behaviors. And problem gaming is just one of those other behaviors. So the more we can have positive youth development, the more developmental assets, the more components where they can feel good about themselves, the less likely this is to be a problem. Thinking about early intervention is also something that we need to talk to parents and caregivers about limit setting. And it's not just screen time, right? It's budgeting, and even with the skids, like my kids are always, when I set them up on their computers, we all share the same iCloud, we all had the same email, like they were doing everything through my email. So I was getting notifications every time they were selling something and doing something. And we check in, and like, no, Mom, it doesn't cost anything. I'm just selling one thing for the other. But I know in talking to my son, we were talking about this last night at dinner, he's got friends that are spending $400 or $500 a pop. And this is what they work really hard. They're, 19, 20-year-olds, but that's where all their money is going. And so we've been having conversations about, okay, what does that mean for them? What happens when they have to have the next greatest thing, or they start to lose money, and how does that work? And then those family protections are really important. And I want to make sure that we understand that this is bilateral. A lot of times we think of young people making some sort of bad decision and it impacting the parents, but it goes both ways. I had a college student a few years ago that came to me in tears. She was a couple years older than traditional students, maybe 25, and her father, they set up an account when she was 16. It was a joint account with her dad, because that's what you do as a good parent, right, to make sure you can follow how your kids are spending money. And her dad depleted over $25,000 that she had saved up for a house because of his gaming addictions. And so just making sure that when you're communicating, but you're also protecting yourselves either as a parent and or as a child if you have concerns about some of those areas. And then the interventions. Matt talked a little bit about the medications, but we know that CBT, motivational interviewing, DBT is really important, and thinking about that. I'm a huge advocate of always focusing on the why people do behaviors, not what they do. And so when people ask me what is the best intervention, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because we know that some people get into these because of the fantasy and the financial aspects that they think could happen. We know for some people it's socialization. We know for some people it's the rush and the thrill. We know other people run to gaming to avoid realities, and this is a good place where they can just kind of like shut down and decompress. So understanding why they're doing it is going to be really critical for figuring out what kind of intervention that you want to put into place. So I know we've talked about this before, but I just want to make sure there probably should be two big circles that aren't even on this page, but I'm not quite that marketing savvy. There's a lot of people who game that will never, ever develop a disorder, and I just want to reiterate that. If I were to ask most people, lots and lots of people, right? How many of you did Wordle today? Not really? Okay, a few of us, right? I got it in 4. I was kind of disappointed. I lost my, okay, it was a little, yeah. Right? Like, so lots of us do games, and we don't think about it as gaming, but we're gaming, right? I'm not even going to tell you what level of Candy Crush I've been on after 10 years of playing that. Like, that's like my secret. And the same thing with gambling, right? We know that people can gamble responsibly. We know that it's entertainment. We know that it can be done safely. So I just want to reiterate that that's not the populations that we're talking about right now. You wouldn't have jobs if that's all we were talking about. So, but as my colleagues have already shared, the population that we're working with is much more tech savvy than we've ever imagined. These are youth, like cryptocurrencies is much harder. Like I would have, if my son set up Bitcoin right now, I would have no idea what he was doing. We have a Fifth Third account, and I can see, I get the little alert, so it's working really well. But there's nothing stopping him from branching off and doing things behind my back that could be detrimental to him. And so again, preparing and educating is really, really important. I think it's also important thinking about this from a developmental standpoint. These are young people who have like never not had the internet. You know, they've been raised on screens. You know, you were saying like the amount of thrill that's at these games is so high. I was elated. I'm going to be in Boston the same week that the Yankees are in town. So if Major League Baseball ever comes back, I'm like, we are so going to that game. And my kids were like, that's going to be the most boring thing ever. I hate baseball. And I'm like, I didn't raise kids to hate baseball. Like, who are these kids? But it's because it doesn't have that same level of you know, the flow and the intensity and the movement that they're used to watching. So baseball is boring. Football is even a little boring to them, which I don't understand. Not my kids. So understanding though what that thrill is really important. And so again, when you're thinking about prevention and work with young people, it's important to think about where their motivation comes from. And I think you already, you know, hit on this, but if you were to ask my kids, like, who are their favorite, you know, people on TV are, they're going to tell you they're streamers and gamers. Like, they don't have favorite actors. They don't have favorite TV shows. When they want their downtime, they're up in their rooms on an iPad or on their computers watching other people play video games, and that's what's fun for them. And so recognizing that when you're thinking about that is really, really important. And so what does this look like? I gotta click here too. Sorry. There we go. Too many screens. So what does this look like, especially when you have comorbidity, right? Dual diagnosis, because we know that a lot of times these do go hand in hand. Like Matt was saying, he's looking at treating depression and anxiety and other kinds of aspects. I think it's trauma tomorrow. I was really excited to see, like trauma's, I don't want to say I'm excited to see trauma, that sounds bad, but I'm excited to see the awareness of that. When we think about the neuroscience that Matt was talking about in general, and then you add trauma on top of that, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the hand-brain model. Okay, so I for the down and dirty, the quick one is you got your thinking brain and you got your feeling brain. And people who have had trauma, often their thinking brain is offline. And so they've got all these big emotions and all these things are happening, and that frontal cortex where they're supposed to have the logic and reasoning and being able to tell themselves this is okay, doesn't work the same way when you're in a heightened state because of trauma. And so that impulse control, that ability to rationalize and make good decisions, oftentimes you want to run away and hide. And for some people, that running away is, I want to get on this and I'm going to just gamble and I'm going to have some fun and I'm going to do my thing. For other people, it's, because of the trauma that they've had, and I see trauma as survival skills. I don't want to downplay negative behaviors or people have done to survive. And I'm very strength-based about the work that I do with families. When people do things, I don't want to judge because I don't live their life. But those survival skills are often not going to make them successful later in life. And so helping them reframe what that is about and understanding like how that's impacting their ability then to make good decisions. You add the alcohol on top of all of that, and it's a very much more complex situation than I think what we first realized. So my hope in all of this is to just help you all take the knowledge that our colleagues have shared and think about how do you need to modify your practice, how do you need to be more proactive in your practice, to make sure that we're providing effective interventions to the right people. So on that note, I think we got question and answer.
Q&A, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I figure we're going to have a few questions here. Fire away.
My first question, and you kind of touched on it with the metaverse, and you did with the rat casino, but I'm really interested in what your guys' thoughts are on Facebook and changing to more of a global meta model with their targeted advertising and stuff like that, and how that's going to feed into development of not only internet gaming disorder, but gambling as well.
In their own currency,
Yes,
too.
exactly.
Right? I mean,
That's a hard one. I mean, in some ways, I think it's largely smoke and mirrors, right?
Yeah,
Facebook
right now,
bought
yeah.
Oculus and wants to figure out a way to try to make money for them, and so they're talking about this. They've been targeting ads at a laser-like level, for years and years. None of that has changed. I actually think the interesting spaces in this sort of metaverse are actually the non-big players, because the big players, what they want is to keep you in their walled gardens. So Facebook doesn't want you to take your Facebook wallet and go and spend it at the Twitter place, right? Like they want you to spend it in the Facebook place. So I think that there's just an inherent tension there that's going to prevent those kind of companies from driving this future. What will happen is all of this kind of open sourcey type stuff where people create communities that do allow the free flow between them. Ultimately, they're going to drown out these big companies. It'll take a while. It may be decades, but the IP issue just becomes too hard,
Right.
I
So
think,
more
to get their
like,
head around.
yeah,
And I also want to say, I'm going to say this to sort of poke a little bit here because we talked about this, but I am of the camp that does not believe video game addiction should be in the DSM at all, and it's not in the APA. And I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, internet gaming disorder, I think, is still a relatively controversial idea, and I think it opens the door for us to talk about food addiction and sex addiction in the same way, and it also, frankly, when any new media comes around, I will group us in a generation. Like we vilify it. Like I'll say my parents told me I was addicted to television. Their parents probably told them that they were addicted to something like that too. New media comes around, kids spend a lot of time on it. The research on video games actually shows people who play video games are more social, are generally speaking happier, they have larger groups of friends, they have larger support networks. And so we run a risk of focusing on internet gaming disorder. We run the risk of tamping down what are actually very pro-social and positive behaviors that our kids have by saying, well, you can only be on the internet, 30 minutes a day. In the same way our parents probably said we can't watch television more than 30 minutes a day. We had to choose between like Love Boat and Fantasy Island. And so I will say I have some concerns about that driving the conversation.
I think the Facebook issue is an interesting one, though, because the demographics of Facebook users are very different than the demographics of esports viewers.
Absolutely.
And so
right. Yeah.
what Facebook is doing is essentially drawing in an older demographic to a lot of the same things that the esports world is already doing with younger demographics.
Yes.
I'm just curious as to what you all see the future of the brain development, because you're talking about these sports being so exciting and there's this constant stimulation, and how that's going to impact brain development in younger people and their ability to sit in a classroom and learn because they're so used to that constant stimulation.
I think there's a lot of I'm thinking critically about how to walk this line. Like Glenn was saying about his opinions on internet gaming addiction, I think there's a lot of misinformation about how ADHD and other disorders develop. These are biological disorders. They're not experiential, right? ADHD doesn't come about because you lived in an environment that was too stimulating, right? That the literature on brain development in adolescence is almost incontrovertible in that it does not suggest that these early experiences are reshaping the brain. So I wouldn't think about them in that way. Living in an esports environment where you've got this constant stream of excitement is not going to put you at risk for developing any sort of disorder. Now, the decisions that you make in that environment may, right? If you choose to gamble and you choose to develop a cryptocurrency behind your parents' back and all of this, those things could lead to problem gaming, but simply being in that environment will not. If it did, right, we would have a generation of kids who are functionally disabled, and that does not exist, right? The rates of addiction in this space are no different than the rates of addiction in other spaces.
Can you just say that when you're studying of rats that you could stimulate the brain so it actually changed the brain chemistry?
Yeah, we're actually chemically or electrically modifying the brain activity.
So would that lend to developmental issues as a result of that stimulation?
So you walk a line between saying an experience you have or a biological experience that you have causes a disorder versus causes you to be a unique individual. Right? What we consider as a society as disordered is something that results in, loss of function, right? Like depression, you can't operate in a normal world. Even in the case of ADHD, it's so debilitating that you can't operate in a normal classroom or in a normal environment. And where we draw that line between what is normal and what is abnormal is what you're effectively describing, right? Yes, these experiences will shape your desire to continue in that environment, but they're not going to make you have ADHD. They're not going to make you depressed. They're not going to cause that sort of disorder, but they may cause you to gravitate towards those things more than not. And that's perfectly normal behavior, right? You could make the same argument about individuals who participate in sports, right? Is being in a football team going to make you more aggressive later in life? And the data says no, right? It being, so I think I really push back against teachers and clinicians who fight with their kids about what I think of as not necessarily important things. It doesn't matter if you're participating in esports or watching videos on YouTube. The data don't suggest that reshapes your brain, right? Spending time on screens, right? There was this whole fear that if you were watching YouTube videos all day that you couldn't work in a functioning society, that it would cause these disorders, and that's been entirely debunked. Right? Screen time has no relationship to achievement of developmental milestones. And so I think you're focusing on the wrong problem if that's where you're going. Focus on the things that actually predict disease,
Yeah,
right?
One of the things you said was that through the brain stimulation, you can cause a rat to become more of a high risk.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and I guess when I thought about high risk, I thought, ooh, high risk can mean some dangerous behaviors. But you're right. I mean, it could be also mean that you're innovative and you're creative.
It could, but it could also mean that you have that predilection. And if the circumstances are right, it will develop into a disorder, right? But if the circumstances aren't right, then that disorder will never happen, right? So, and that's just where our intervention strategies come in, where our social support systems come in. And the earlier we can recognize who is at risk and what factors contribute to that risk, the better we can intervene earlier in that development, if you will.
I mean, I look at more of the environmental factors. You know, how many times if we've got a little kid that's at a restaurant that's crying, what do we give them? Hand them our phone. And we don't interact with them. We don't, you know, we don't, because we're really good parents. But other people, right? And to me, you know, we were kind of laughing as both parents of college students and also working at the university, the problem solving of young people. And I'm very pro parent, but there's a lot of parents out there that want to do everything for their kids. And so they don't learn how to make good decisions because they've never had to. Someone's made them for them. Or if they've made a mistake, someone fixes it for them and they've never had to have consequences. And so to me, I'm more concerned personally about those kind of components in the way that they shape and like the socialization. You know, I was talking to my son who's, you know, freshman year COVID, sat in his dorm by himself. His interaction was all online. And that's why I always said, like, if you want to play video games, at least you're talking to people. But now I'm like, hey, like, open your door. And he's like, nobody opens their door in college, Mom. Like, that's unheard of. It's different. I train all the social work field students at Miami. My favorite assignment is to make them pick up the phone and cold call people. And they hate it. Those of you who work with interns know, like, they hate, like, why? They even say, this is the stupidest assignment. I can find it all on Google. Like, it's not about the Google. It's about that personal connection.
I don't even like calling Domino's.
I want to.
That's why you work with rats.
Yeah.
I want to flip the narrative a little because I think there is one key component to playing video games that is so valuable that our generation, I think, largely missed out on, which is related to decision making, which is that video game play rewards failure, and we have been raised to only succeed. Failure is bad. I keep telling these guys about my favorite podcast, but they had a recent interview with Annie Duke, the poker player who wrote some great books on decision making, and she was talking about the fallacy that poker players make, which is, you know, when they win, they think they made a good decision, you know, and when they lose, they think they made a bad decision. I'm sorry, when they lose, they think they have bad luck. So when they win, it's a good decision. When they lose, it's bad luck. And that's a mistake. Because they don't see losing as a learning opportunity. Video games, like, there's a movie called Live, Die, Repeat, which got renamed Edge of Tomorrow with Emily Blunt and Tom Cruise. And the idea is that this terrible soldier gets, like, sprayed with alien goo, and he relives the same day, like Groundhog Day, to become a super soldier and eventually saves the world. Giving away the end there. But, like, that's what they get to do, right? They fail and they pick themselves up and they do it again. And this is what video games teach them is like each time you do something, you learn something and then you get better. Like, you never win the boss fight at the end of the game the first time you do it. You do it over and over and over. And that sort of resilience is what we want our kids to have, right? And video games do a good job of helping to build that. So I just want to say for the experience, there actually are some very unique benefits to it.
And also, you know, a lot of our parents are raising kids, and you know, we're not going to keep score in t-ball, and there's no winners, or we're going to give out trophies for 16th place. In the video game, there's actually a winner or a loser on a lot of them. Not all of them, but
there is. But again, you get the chance to do it over and over again, right? Which is not just like you have the one tournament and then you're the loser t-ball team.
that's right. Yeah. Kurt, I know you had a question.
Those of us who are long of tooth understand that there is something that's constant, and that is that regulation always lags technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, what does your group, your colleagues, how are they keeping up with this technology in order to do reasonable regulation?
They're not.
Yeah, there's that.
I mean, like even if you think about traditional gaming, like casinos, racinos, lotteries, they're not keeping up with the technology there. Bill was highlighting how e-lotteries are becoming more and more common. They're not keeping up with that, right? The data that casinos are collecting on individual players, they're not tracking it. The casinos are using it. The casinos are using it to increase their revenue from each player, to milk that last dollar out of the player before they leave. But they're not sharing that data with the state, and they're not thinking about gaming outside of their brick and mortar walls, right? The state legislators, or the state regulators are looking at casinos and they're saying, well, share your data with us. But that client is leaving the casino and going down the street and pulling out their phone and bringing up DraftKings, or they're walking down to the gas station and buying a lottery ticket, and there's no transfer of information across those services. The data silos that are put around these sort of brick and mortar establishments are preventing us from really getting a whole picture of what each individual gambler is doing, right? If you're at a bar and you work at a bar and somebody's drunk and you kick them out, they go to the next bar, there's nothing to stop that bartender from giving them a drink, right? There's no sharing of information across these different sources of betting. And there's certainly no collection of information in some of these newer forms of betting that are completely under the radar from regulators.
And what's funny to Bill and what he was saying, Kurt, is not only that is, a lot of the gambling institutions, I won't just single out casinos, but a lot of the gambling institutions are like 5-year-olds on the playground. They're all like, mine, and they don't want. Not only do they not share the information, they fight the sharing of information, even with the regulators. We just, the Institute just reviewed the proposed rules on sport betting in Ohio, and the initial rules that were proposed had the independent integrity monitor not having the information about who the bettor was. They didn't place the bet with the bettor. Well, how do you wrestle with money laundering, match fixing, all those kind of consumer protections if you don't know who the bettor is? Now, of course, we're trying to protect people's privacy. The casino has the information already. Their privacy is not protected. They're using that information, as Matt said, to squeeze the last dollar they can out of them. But they, of course, kind of play. They play on, we have to protect privacy, and to get legislators to fight the sharing of information. One of the things we're at the Institute doing, and Kurt, you and I are both fans of NCLGS, the National Council of Legislators from Gaming States. And we both know Steve Geller, so we've endured Steve. But one of the things about that is Miami's taking on the data and research facility for NCLGS, and one of the things we're working on is making sure that all the agencies inside the state. So if Kentucky were to do sport betting, we would strongly encourage that the bulk of that will all be done online, and there'll be data. We want that data collected, and then we want that combined with the data from the lottery and collecting that data. And then you can protect anonymous things, and you can protect people's privacy, but you have to get the data, and somebody's got to analyze that data, and these are the people that'll do it to make sure that we're at the cutting edge of fighting these problems. And the Institute's trying to play an important part in that.
It may help explain why so much of what we see the legislatures in Kentucky, for example, doing is this is so complex that they go to something simpler that they can make speeches about.
Yeah. Well, Nevada does it this way. It must be right.
I'm saying that's a reasonable adaptation
to
facing an overwhelming complexity.
Yeah, the conversations that I've had with Ohio legislators about the state sports betting law that's under, I guess now has been passed.
Yes, passed.
A lot of those conversations, we would start talking about data and sharing, and they would just shut down. They don't want to talk. They don't want to think about data. They don't have the experience to even consider data. And it was just a hard hill to climb, right? The issues were very complex, and you're right. That's the survival strategy, right?
But remember, the Wire Act that we talked about earlier today, the Wire Act forbids transferring data in the furtherance of gambling. But what we're trying to do through NCLGS and others is get entities to collect the data in order to further the fight against problem gaming, money laundering, match fixing, consumer protections, all those CAMT things. We want different entities to share that data so that we can do our job as an institute and provide cutting edge, solutions to problems.
But it's a perspective that we spent 2 decades worrying about the Wire Act. Meanwhile, technology was making everything that was done
Obsolete.
completely obsolete.
Yeah.
It was a very difficult period.
Yeah, my favorite, the city of Cincinnati spent over $100 million to build the technology of a streetcar through downtown Cincinnati in an age when driverless cars are very close in the future. And
I will say, and even I think another layer of complexity there is that in the previous era, there were a number of big players, a small number of big players. Yeah. Like the analogy would be like in the past, the government had to fight nation states, and so it was easy to have a military because you knew the nation states were right, and now we're not fighting nation states, right? We're fighting a ton of tiny little factions and organizations, and that's the same thing that's been happening here. That it isn't about as much as the big casinos think they're going to own this space, they will not own this space, and they're going to be a million little tiny things. And that makes regulation so much harder because, it's just there's every little permutation and they're all, evolutionarily evolving in real time, every one of those. That makes it very hard.
I was going to ask, if we were to take steps towards trying to regulate this, it seems like the first step would be to set these types of things under one specific agency, because right now, a lot of our internet usage is under, I think it's FTC laws, and then there's another portion with the video games that's under FCC. So we would have to move them into one or create an entire different regulatory body to manage both.
That's a good point.
So my thought would be, what would that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, currently it's all state-based, right? The national government doesn't.
State-based because it's the internet technology transcends borders.
Right.
It just erases them. So if we're trying to legislate it at a state or local level or even a federal, it's almost impossible to do because I can just skip that with a VPN.
Yeah, you've hit directly on the catch-22 of all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you start talking about mobile gaming, right? You can drive across the border and your cell tower you're connected to now is no longer in New Jersey, it's in Pennsylvania, and all of a sudden you can place a bet in DraftKings.
Yeah.
Right? So that sort of immediate transition is really reshaping things when it's all driven by state policy.
That comment is one of the largest sports betting sites in the Louisville area is the McDonald's in New Albany, across the bridge. And it's illegal in Kentucky, but you go over there and
Use their Wi-Fi.
your phone is live.
Yep.
yeah, but every kid at UK has a friend somewhere else, and they can Venmo the money to them and get around it. Yeah, I know you had a question back there.
I probably have less of a question and more of a wondering out loud with you.
You're with the right people.
And because when I was actively working with the treatment of gambling disorders, very few of my clients did anything that we're talking about. They were primarily criminal justice referrals. I was working a lot with drug dealers where cash was, they weren't going to casinos. They were operating at street level. And I guess and you talked about how they don't have, a lot of folks in minority communities have disparity in terms of access to even the internet. And so I guess I'm wondering what work you're doing and research and evaluation of persons of color, folks who are oppressed, minority communities, people who experience disparity, because they don't have that equipment.
It's not your son, it's you, right? That because of Candy Crush, you're part of that. So I do think mobile still extends pretty far into those communities, but console gaming and PC gaming are kind of two different worlds too. Console gaming tends to reach more into communities of color. So I guess I'm just saying no, we're not doing anything. We should be doing things. It's a good question.
Well, and I think it goes back to the why are they gambling? Because it's going to be different at the street level. And I'll be honest, I first walked in, I was like, I can't see everybody, but this is a pretty white crowd. And thank you. I didn't see you back. Yes. So, I mean, the reality is that many people of color prefer to get treatment from people who look like them and who understand their story. And so if people are needing help, they're not going to come to us. And so I think as an organization, you need to look at like what's happening in your worlds that you're not able to recruit more or retain more minority populations, marginalized populations, LGBTQ community, like whatever your demographics need to be in order to support the needs of your community.
I know we're getting the hook here because we're a little bit over time already, but we want to continue this
We can take.
Oh, can we take another? Okay.
You have succeeded in exploding my head.
They do that to me every day.
It's like a whole new world to me because a lot of this is, and I'm still perplexed with a lot of the language you use. It was the jargon. Some of it I didn't even understand, but I got the gist of it with all the technology and all the changes. I guess the bottom line, kind of a follow-up on the gentleman that just asked the question. As a result of all this, are we seeing a significant increase in people seeking help for problems associated with gaming? Or is it just the same? Are they still? Maybe they're not having problems. Maybe it's like with me. I was a baseball fanatic growing up, and I turned out pretty good. But maybe there's no dysfunction in it if it's not harmful to my life. So as a result of all this technology, what has been the increase in numbers that are seeking help because of the disorder? A disorder, not that.
I can't give you formal statistics. My thought is we need to be more proactive and preventative so we don't wait until it is an issue.
Sure.
And I do think that, a lot of the people that come into practice, traditional white middle class practice, let's just clarify that, are family members saying you need to get help because there's a problem. And if you're working with young people, it's I'm worried about my son, he's on the computer too much or he's not doing the and again, so sometimes it's defined by not the individual as needing help, but by somebody else saying that you need help.
Right.
So I can't say that I'm seeing a ton, but I'm also not, that's an area that we haven't started researching yet and clearly need to.
And it's such a dynamic, changing environment, too, with new options coming online almost weekly, it feels like. I mean, sports betting in Ohio is going to be starting next year, right? I think it's almost like we don't know what the future will hold and how these new opportunities will reshape the climate. If you just look nationwide at prevalence rates, they've actually been fairly stable, but that doesn't mean there aren't a large proportion of people who aren't seeking treatment. So some of that's confounded by COVID, some of it's not, I don't know. So.
And I think with the younger demographic talking about too, I know we did a informal study. One of our interns that was at a local prevention agency was talking to fraternities, talking to sororities, talking to athletes, and I was shocked, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, the percentage of athletes that are, and students in general, that are spending way more than I make a year sometimes on gambling when you look at it. And some of that though is the unlimited parental support and bailouts and other aspects that it's not personally impacting them at that same level that it might be in a few more years when they're a little bit more independent.
And one takeaway, if you have any young people that want to be on Glenn's, esports teams.
We have full ride scholarships.
Yeah.
Yes. Full ride scholarships.
But if you got great kids that are passionate about esports, you show them Matt's statistics of what drinking at an early age does to your hitting the things in your brain, and Sharon will develop a message for you to make sure that they stay away from drinking at an early age. So with that,
One question, Jody.
okay.
When I first learned more about gaming, and I mostly work with an adult population for gambling, I thought, well, this doesn't really pertain to me. And then I started to ask more at intake about previous gaming, and almost 100% of my clients had previous gaming experience before gambling. And that really, so for everybody in the room and listening, virtually, you have to ask, at intake. And then I also started to address when people relapsed, what was happening, and most of them were going back to sports video gaming.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment because people don't think of it in the same way that they think about traditional brick and mortar gaming or even like gaming on the street, right? It's to them it's a different thing, but it's not, right? So I think even if you're not acknowledging that or helping your patients acknowledge that, you're missing out on the whole picture of what their gambling behaviors are.
Well, thank you very
Yes, thank
much.
you.
I know